Welcome to the third episode of the most influential horror films of all time. Today, we're exploring a movie that forever changed the way we see zombies. George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead. Released in 1968, this low-budget indie film redefined the zombie genre and left a lasting mark on both horror and, albeit unintentionally, society. In this video, I'll analyze its influence and explain why its simplistic formula still resonates with audiences today. Hi, my name is Pat, welcome to the third episode of this mini-series, and without further ado, let's get started. The origins of cinematic zombies trace back to Haitian voodoo mythology, where the concept of zombification was rooted in the belief that the powerful sorcerer, or bokor, could bring a dead person back to life to serve him as a mindless slave. This concept was introduced to Western audiences through travelogues, sensationalist stories, and early horror films. In Haiti, zombies were not autonomous creatures. A zombie reflected the fears of colonialism and the loss of personal autonomy.
Zombie, corpses taken from their grave, or made to work. Sugar mill, meals at night.
In White Zombie, the earliest example of zombies in cinema history, the zombies are created through the dark arts of voodoo magic. The film portrays these zombies as lifeless, emotionless shells who perform labor and carry out commands, reflecting a fear of subjugation and enslavement. In White Zombie, the film's antagonist, an evil sorcerer named Murder Legendre, played by Bela Lugosi, uses voodoo magic to control the dead, bending them to his will. The zombies are not mindless killers but obedient slaves who do their master's bidding without question. These early cinematic zombies are best understood as disposable henchmen, willing pawns in the hands of necromancers or voodoo priests, used for menial labor, assassination, or terrorizing others. They were animated by external magic, and when the caster was killed, the spell was broken. In these films, the real threat wasn't the zombies, but the puppeteers who controlled them. The undead were merely a means to highlight the villain's power over life and death. Early zombies lacked the terrifying potential of a global apocalypse, as they weren't driven by instinct but by the commands of their masters. Before George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead, zombies were not the flesh-eating monsters we think of today. The Romero zombies were no longer controlled by magic but brought back to life by an unknown vague cause. But the cause was secondary to their terrifying new nature. These creatures were mindless but deadly, acting without purpose beyond survival by feeding on the living. In this way, Romero created a monster that was both horrifying and tragic, humans reduced to base animalistic instincts. The shift from the traditional voodoo zombie to Romero's flesh-eating ghouls became the foundation for many future zombie films. The living dead were no longer mere servants. They became independent agents of chaos, capable of overwhelming societies through sheer numbers and relentless hunger. The concept of a zombie apocalypse where hordes of undead monsters overrun civilization emerged from Night of the Living Dead, becoming a staple in horror movies and post-apocalyptic storytelling. Films like Dawn of the Dead, the direct sequel, 28 Days Later, and World War Z, as well as TV shows like The Walking Dead, owe their entire existence to the template Romero established. One of Romero's most important contributions to the zombie genre beyond their flesh-eating nature was the overwhelming sense of hopelessness that permeates his films. In Night of the Living Dead, survival may seem possible at first, but as the film progresses, it becomes clear that internal conflict among the survivors, combined with the sheer number of zombies, make escape nearly impossible. This bleak, nihilistic tone set the standard for future zombie and post-apocalyptic films. Romero introduced a recurring theme in the genre, survival horror. It was no longer just about combating the external threat of zombies, but the flaws of humanity and society. The survivors' inability to work together due to harboring mistrust and prejudices often leads to their downfall. In Night of the Living Dead, Ben, the most rational and competent character, is tragically killed at the end, mistaken for a zombie by a white mob, reinforcing the film's themes of racial violence and senseless death. This pessimistic ending became a hallmark of the genre, where happy endings are rare and survival often comes at a devastating cost. The sense of inevitable doom and societal collapse remains central to the genre today. In films like I Am Legend and TV shows like The Walking Dead, we see this same combination of external threats and internal division among survivors, leading to chaos and destruction. Romero's approach to horror wasn't just about the monsters outside, but about the monsters within, the failures of society, the breakdown of trust, and the collapse of human cooperation in the face of crises. The production of Night of the Living Dead is a story of resourcefulness. George A. Romero and his small team worked with a budget of $114,000, which even by 1968 standards was incredibly low. To save money, the film was shot in black and white, a choice that, rather than detracting from the experience, ended up adding a gritty documentary-like realism. This unpolished look increased the feel of horror, adding a disturbing sense of authenticity and helping to blur the line between fiction and reality. Night of the Living Dead also carved out a new path for independent filmmaking, particularly in the horror genre. With the shoestring budget and a team of dedicated creators, Romero proved that you did not need Hollywood backing or a massive budget to create a film that could have significant cultural and commercial impact. The success of Night of the Living Dead at the box office, where it grossed over 30 million worldwide, showed that indie films could be both financially viable and critically successful. This legacy of low-budget success has had lasting influence on the horror genre. Movies like The Blair Witch Project, Saw, Paranormal Activity, and 28 Days Later all followed in the footsteps of Night of the Living Dead, proving that horror, more than many other genres, allows filmmakers to create tension, fear, and atmosphere with minimal resources. These films relied heavily on creative storytelling, inventive special effects, and immersive atmosphere to draw viewers in, much like Romero did with his use of black and white film and a claustrophobic farmhouse setting. Paranormal Activity, shot with minimal special effects and a budget of only $15,000, focused on the slow-building tension of a haunted house and became one of the most profitable films of all time, making over 190 million worldwide. These films succeeded because movies like Night of the Living Dead proved strong concepts rather than expensive sets of A-list stars are important for a movie. They highlighted a key truth of storytelling. You don't need big budgets, you need a good idea executed well. Horror is one of the few genres where filmmakers can truly thrive with a limited budget. While blockbuster films often require elaborate sets, special effects, and high production values to draw in audiences, horror has always been a genre that rewards creativity and innovation over spectacle. The reason why it works so well for horror is that the fear comes not from what is shown, but from what is suggested or implied. People fear what we don't understand, and not showing it plays a big part in it. Atmosphere, tension, and psychological unease are the real cornerstones of effective horror. And these elements don't require huge budgets. How often have you watched a horror movie build tension around a creature only to end up being let down by the reveal? On that note, let me know what your biggest horror disappointment was in the comments down below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. In horror movies, less is usually more. Many horror films benefit from their simplicity by focusing on the tension within a single location or a small group of characters. By doing so, filmmakers can make audiences feel claustrophobic and unsettled while also getting to know their characters, which in turn increase the immersion. Night of the Living Dead is a perfect example of this. Set almost entirely within a small isolated farmhouse, the film's tension comes from the growing mistrust and fear among the survivors, more so than the zombies themselves. The lack of elaborate special effects forced Romero to focus on the human drama and the psychological horror of being trapped in a nightmare situation, which made the film more intense and relatable to audiences. This tradition of low-budget horror continues to this day, with indie filmmakers pushing the boundaries of the genre. Movies like Get Out, which was made for just $4.5 million, use horror to explore societal issues, much like Romero did with Night of the Living Dead. These films prove that with a strong concept and creative execution, even a small budget horror film can leave a lasting impact on both audiences and the film industry. On the surface, Night of the Living Dead is a simple story about a group of people trying to survive a zombie outbreak. But beneath the horror lies a biting commentary on the social and political issues that gripped America in the late 1960s. Race relations, the Vietnam War, societal collapse, and the growing distrust of authority and in the government. The film's stark, unsentimental portrayal of the breakdown of social order resonated deeply with audiences, many of whom were living through similar crises. Race relations and civil rights. Perhaps the most poignant social theme in Night of the Living Dead is its commentary on race relations. One of Romero's most groundbreaking decisions was casting Dwayne Jones, an African-American actor, in the lead role as Ben. While the role wasn't written with race in mind, casting Jones in 1968 at the height of American civil rights movement added unintentional but powerful social commentary to the film. Though George A. Romero insisted that Dwayne Jones was cast as Ben simply because he was the best actor for the role, the racial implications of having a black man in the lead during the height of the civil rights movement were undeniable. At the time, the US was in the throes of civil rights struggle with widespread protests against racial injustice and segregation.
Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. earlier the same year added to the racial tensions, and the nation was grappling with violence, discrimination, and the fight for equality. Casting a black man as the hero who takes charge and leads a group of white survivors was revolutionary for 1968.
If you stay up here, you take orders from me!
Particularly because Jones' race was never addressed in the script. In a time when black actors were often relegated to secondary roles or cast in stereotypical parts, seeing a black actor as the calm, intelligent leader among a group of white survivors was radical and to some infuriating departure from the norm. The film's ending, in which Ben, the sole survivor, is mistaken for a zombie and shot by a white mob, struck a particularly painful chord. In the context of 1960s America, where lynchings and racially motivated violence were still prevalent. Ben's death felt like a tragic reflection of the real-life violence faced by black Americans. The mob, without any hesitation, guns him down, mistaking him for a monster simply because they assume his presence in the house makes him part of the threat. This senseless, racially charged death served as a stark reminder of the ongoing dehumanization and mistreatment of African Americans in the United States. Though Romero may not have intended for Ben's death to be a commentary on the racial situation, it was impossible for audiences to ignore the parallels to the racial violence that permeated the era. It was a reflection of the real-world horrors of racial prejudice in America. In addition to its commentary on race, Night of the Living Dead can also be interpreted as a metaphor for the collapse of society and the growing divisions in America during the Vietnam War. By 1968, the US was deeply divided over its involvement in the war, with anti-war protests erupting across the country. The country was polarized, with people on all sides feeling that society was unraveling. Similarly divisive as it is now, with the US presidential elections coming up. The survivors in Night of the Living Dead represent a microcosm of society, trapped in a small farmhouse. The group is unable to work together and set their fears aside, which inevitably leads to their downfall. Romero, intentionally or not, cleverly uses the zombie outbreak as a metaphor for the way societies tear themselves apart in times of crises. As the survivors argue, mistrust each other, and ultimately fail to cooperate, the zombies, much like the external pressure of war and political unrest, continue to close in. The film also reflects the growing distrust of authority that was prevalent during the Vietnam era. The military and government are conspicuously absent from the film, leaving the characters to fend for themselves. This reflects the growing cynicism and loss of faith in institutions during the time when many Americans felt that the government was failing to protect them both domestically and abroad. And that distrust never fully went away. The chaos and ineffectiveness of the survivors in the farmhouse mirrored the larger sense of chaos and disillusionment that many felt during the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement, or more recently during the pandemic. When Night of the Living Dead was released in 1968, it shocked audiences in ways no one had anticipated. Horror films at the time were still largely restrained compared to today's standards, relying on implied violence or supernatural elements that were clearly fictional. Audiences were used to campy monsters and gothic settings of earlier horror films like Frankenstein or Dracula. But Night of the Living Dead was different. It didn't rely on far-off fantastical threats, it brought the horror into the real world. And it didn't hold back on the graphic, visceral details that were only topped a few years later by The Exorcist. The film's depictions of violence, particularly in the final act where zombies devour the remains of the survivors, were unheard of in mainstream cinema at the time. Romero didn't shy away from showing the gore. Audiences saw bodies being torn apart and eaten in grotesque detail. This level of brutality was unprecedented and left many viewers in shock. What made it even more intense was that Night of the Living Dead was released before the MPAA rating system was in place, meaning there were no guidelines for audiences. Parents who brought their children expecting a typical monster movie were horrified to be confronted with such graphic depictions of violence and death. The film's depiction of cannibalism in particular caused widespread outrage. While other films hinted at disturbing or grotesque acts, Night of the Living Dead showed them in full view, leaving nothing to the imagination. The rawness of the violence combined with the gritty black and white cinematography made the horror feel all the more real and unsettling. Despite, or perhaps because of the controversy, Night of the Living Dead became a huge success.
The film got hot in France, and then a few of the critics that had slammed on it here noticed that the French were noticing it.
The pushback against the film's graphic content only added to its notoriety, drawing more people to theaters who wanted to see what the fuss was all about. The film's success, despite the controversy, helped pave the way for more explicit depictions of horror in the years to come. One of the most lasting impacts of Night of the Living Dead's release was the conversation it sparked around film censorship and content guidelines. The outrage over the film's graphic violence helped lead to the creation of the MPAA rating system in 1968, which would assign ratings to films to guide viewers on appropriate content. This system marked the end of the Hays Code era, a strict set of moral guidelines that had governed Hollywood since the 1930s. Romero had unknowingly sparked a revolution in how horror films were made and perceived. The influence of Night of the Living Dead extends far beyond movie horror. It redefined storytelling and transcended into other media. The bleak ending, where no one is safe and survival is fleeting, has since become a staple of movie cinema. Night of the Living Dead also had a profound impact on post-apocalyptic storytelling. The concept of small group of survivors banding together to face an overwhelming apocalyptic threat can be traced directly back to Romero's film. The survivors in the farmhouse were a template for countless future stories in both horror and science fiction, stories where the external threat can be less dangerous than the internal conflicts among survivors. Beyond genre films, Night of the Living Dead's success showed that independent films could have a massive cultural and financial impact. Romero's film opened the door for countless indie filmmakers, showing them that success didn't require Hollywood's backing, it required a great idea and the resourcefulness to make it happen. In games like Resident Evil, Left 4 Dead and The Last of Us, Romero's influence is clear. These games build on concept of isolation, constant danger and limited supplies, elements that are hallmarks of Romero's work. Resident Evil, for example, is often cited as the first major survival horror game, and it drew heavily from Romero's vision of zombies as terrifying independent threats. In Resident Evil, players have to scavenge for ammunition, medical supplies and tools to stay alive, creating a constant sense of tension as every resource is precious. Beyond resource management, these games echo Romero's portrayal of zombies as overwhelming forces that players must outsmart, avoid, or sometimes face in small numbers to survive. The zombies themselves are typically slow but relentless, mirroring Romero's creatures and adding a psychological layer of the gameplay where players feel like survival is always just beyond their reach. In Left 4 Dead, Dead Island, Dying Light, and so forth, teamwork is essential, just as Romero's survivors needed to band together to survive. Here, the collaborate play element mirrors the group dynamics and internal conflicts seen in Night of the Living Dead, emphasizing that the real horror often comes not just from the zombies but from the stress and breakdown of human relationships. Romero's influence created a massive legacy that was carried on by TV and video games, and each iteration continues to evolve, implementing new ideas and adding twists and spins to the genre. His portrayal of zombies as an unstoppable, relentlessly consuming force laid the groundwork for the genre's defining traits. It proves that his impact on horror is far-reaching and continues to shape how audiences experience fear across all forms of media today. Looking at Night of the Living Dead today, aspects of the film might seem dated, the black and white photography, the practical effect, or the story pacing. However, its core elements remain astoundingly relevant. Compare it to modern works like The Last of Us or The Walking Dead and you'll find much of the same small groups of survivors fighting both the undead and their own human nature while struggling to manage resources. While contemporary productions might have bigger budgets, better effects, and more sophisticated storytelling techniques, they all build on the foundation Romero laid in 1968. The claustrophobic tension of the farmhouse siege, the political undertones, the focus on human drama amid a crumbling society, these elements remain as powerful today as they were 50 years ago. What makes Night of the Living Dead truly special isn't that it created the modern zombie genre, it's that it demonstrated how horror could be both entertaining and meaningful. Whether it's the social commentary of Get Out, the post-apocalyptic drama of Last of Us, or the opinionated human conflicts in The Walking Dead, these works follow Romero's example of using horror to explore deeper truths about society and human nature. In an era of high-budget streaming shows and photorealistic video games, Night of the Living Dead might appear primitive, but its influence is undeniable. Every shuffling walker in The Walking Dead, every infected in The Last of Us, and every zombie in countless other works directly owe its existence to Romero's vision. He didn't just create a monster, he essentially created a lens through which we continue to examine humanity. The film's legacy reminds us that true innovation doesn't require massive budgets or cutting-edge technology, it requires vision, creativity, and the courage to break new ground. Night of the Living Dead isn't just a horror classic, it's a testament to the power of lasting impact of original ideas. In the next episode, we'll be looking beyond the jaw, analyze how one movie redefined an old genre and changed the industry forever with its unconventional release. With that said, thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, check out some of my other stuff. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and I hope to welcome you again in the next one.